Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today, and specifically, thank you for coming to listen to my talk. I'll be talking to you about linking survey and social media data, specifically in understanding society. But more generally, we can think about some of the methods and issues that arise using this kind of linkage methods. Before I start that, you'll see a couple of these names following on because we're all working as part of a project. Curtis Jessup at NatSen and Luke Sloan at University of Cardiff and I are working on a grant together to look at this project, collection of methodologies and the various aspects that go into linking Twitter specifically and survey data together. And Alexander Vence, who will also be giving a talk today, has been working with us, analyzing the data and working on the project very closely. So some of the things that I will be talking about today will be kind of background and context and lead into their talks, although there won't be any overlap and we won't really be talking about the same things. I will be talking today about some of the research that we have done previously and kind of how that follows into the work that we're doing going forward. So to begin, wanted to outline why and the thoughts behind this. So we're obviously looking at linking survey and Twitter data. And one of the initial reasons why I started to think about this was, there's this non-response or attrition problem in longitudinal surveys that we know exists where people aren't answering surveys at the rate that they used to. So could we use a supplementary data source like social media? People have turned to social media solely, for example, to say it's an alternative. We're saying maybe one way to kind of overcome some of the issues is to bring it together and link them together. But we can also use this data to supplement additional personal information, both for Twitter data and for survey data. So we're bringing in new data for both sources, which will improve both data sources. So we're not just looking to improve survey data. I'm a survey researcher potentially looking for methods to supplement and improve survey data. But my colleague Luke, who I mentioned, is a social media data methodologist, so to speak, and has been leading on that and really has been focused on how can survey data improve the methodologies used in social media research. So we're kind of two sides of the same coin. Now, there's a lot of other aspects, but those are we can see how it could improve both sources of data together. And by doing that, we're going to consider multiple methodological and ethical issues that are unique to this kind of data linkage that you don't see maybe in either source alone. So one of the methodological issues that sometimes people bring up is, well, social media isn't universal. And there is some truth to that. But you can see that that's diminishing, and it's at some level going to end up being, a non-factor entirely, in the sense that you can see in the past 9 years, 2020 being the most recent. This is ONS data that's available. The number of people who have said they've accessed the internet to access social media has jumped from 45% to 70%. And you can see that at the younger age groups, it's near universal, in particular, obviously, in the youngest age group. And you can see a decline over time, but generational change will suggest that these people aren't going to stop using social media as they get older, probably. The types of social media or what the social media may change, but they're not going to stop using social media. And the people who don't use social media will eventually no longer be part of the population. And so coverage of social media will be very similar to telephone or other kinds of coverage. So that's a plus. And so we're getting more and more coverage of the population through social media, and obviously internet use is ahead of that. Now, to give you some other data points, an online panel, so we're going to have some skew to this because these are people who are already online, who are internet users, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, said that they use the Facebook account. 79% of them said they use the Facebook account regularly, and 47% said they use Twitter account. Now, in terms of Twitter, that's higher than we've seen in other data, which say about, in the UK at least, about 25 to 30% of the population are active users of Twitter to some extent, or at least have a Twitter account. Excuse me. Most Facebook and Twitter both released data in 2013. It's the most recent data that they've released. This is in the UK, so this is their monthly active Facebook users, 33 million monthly active Facebook users, 15 million monthly active Twitter users. This is of 2013. If we assume that it follows some trend up similar at the top, those numbers are only going to have gone up, obviously, in the past 8 years. So we can expect a much higher coverage, much higher usage rate as we go forward in social media, at least generally, if not these two specific platforms. So what are we trying and why? I've already kind of alluded to this to some extent. We're obviously trying to link respondents' personal Twitter accounts, public held information, to their survey responses. So that's the general what. The why is we could potentially benefit survey data. I've talked about some of the potential uses, but what does it provide? Social media will provide potentially real-time, quote-unquote, natural. So this is not structured. This is what they want to provide, but in a real-time essence, behavioral and attitudinal data, which we could potentially use as between wave measures, for example, in a longitudinal survey like Understanding Society. For Twitter, as I mentioned, we're also looking to improve Twitter. One of the things about Twitter methodologies is they're good at maybe analyzing the data, but they don't really know the who much about the people who they're collecting the data from on Twitter. There's a lot of information about what they're saying, but not who they are. And so the survey data can potentially provide information on methodologies to estimate what kind of people are saying these things, and provide a potential sample frame for social media or Twitter researchers to use going forward. Generally, we can look at different groups, so now we can do better subgroup of analysis of Twitter data that have been previously possible. But we're also going down and saying, one of the things that's a real problem is how do we archive this type of data for other researchers, for wider research use? Obviously, Understanding Society is trying to provide a data resource, as are many researchers, and how can we make this data usable to other researchers while maintaining things like anonymity and other ethical considerations? A key point that I want to make here is this bottom point, is we're not interested in contrasting that you see in so many research projects looking at social media and survey data. There's always trying this, people are saying, oh, survey media data is better, or social media data is better. We're making no such claim and don't want to make any such claim. We are going to acknowledge that there are differences, and we want to identify what those differences are between the two. We're not saying as much, but we see these kind of as two different data sources that complement one another and can be used to create new and innovative data resources. Instead of trying to say my data is better than yours, or trying to say, use this one and not that one. We're trying to say maybe you can use both, and in what instances can you use both? So that's the background of the what and why and how, to some extent. And here we're going to get to kind of the first stage. When we're sitting and thinking about, okay, now we want to do this, the first thing you have to do in a survey is ask people consent to link that. Obviously, there's ethical considerations in doing such, right? There's an ethical reason why you would want to ask people consent. You want to make sure that they are informed and understand what they're trying to do. But from a purely logistics standpoint, we don't know their Twitter handle. We have to ask them for their Twitter handle in the minimum. So we have to tell them what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then ask them for the Twitter handle, both for ethical but also logistic reasons. We want to make sure that we provide them enough information that they understand what we're doing, but they're not overwhelmed. So we want to have informed consent, but not overwhelming levels of information. So the steps to this is relatively straightforward, in the sense that we need to identify Twitter users first. but then other aspects aren't so straightforward. So just generally in consent to surveys, in surveys research, there's questions about whether you should put consent questions early or late. Much of the research suggests you get better consent rates when you put the consent question early as opposed to late in the survey. But you also want to think about how to ask. That goes to what we were just talking about. But then once we get that consent, we want to understand how come they consented, and is there a potential bias? Did we get potentially differential consent rates across groups or individuals, or that somehow may bias our data that we are able to collect? Does mode have an impact? So do they, if they're responding in various survey modes, is their likelihood of consenting different? And then we also are thinking potentially about measurement error in linkage data. This is where, we have to ask for their Twitter handle. Do they give us a correct Twitter handle? Do they give us a usable Twitter handle? So we began this work, and our initial work is based on 3 UK studies, particularly the British Social Attitude Survey of 2015. This was a cross-sectional survey. All of the respondents were surveyed in a face-to-face mode. The NatSen panel, which was conducted in July 2017, as the name indicates, it's a longitudinal study. It uses the BSA, the British Social Attitude Survey, 2015 and 2016 samples as its sampling frame. So people who answered the BSA in 2015 or 2016 were also recruited into the NatSen panel. And so you're going to have respondents from those surveys in the July 2017 panel. It used a sequential mixed mode survey, so it tried to survey everybody in a web survey initially, and then those who weren't, they followed up with on a telephone survey for non-respondents. And then the third survey is the innovation panel, which is part of the Understanding Society survey. It is also obviously a panel study conducted since 2008. And it had 2 main modes. Either people were approached first in a face-to-face survey, or CAPI, or they were approached first in a sequential mixed mode web survey. So they were approached first in a web, and then non-respondents were followed up by face-to-face. So we have a mixture of modes in NatSen panel and the innovation panel. Now, this is the question, and it's largely reflected in the NatSen panels, very much the same question. So this is the question that was asked in the innovation panel in 2017, the 10th wave of the innovation panel. I'm not obviously going to read it all here, nor do I expect you to read it all. It does seem lengthy for a survey question, but relatively shorter than what might be expected of what we would want to necessarily communicate to try to give a full overview of obviously everything I've just presented. So we're trying to summarize to some extent the why, the how the data will be used, the who will be using it, how it will be accessed, the privacy considerations, and that they can withdraw. All of the things that we might want to communicate in as short a time frame, but as informative as possible kind of way possible. Now, this kind of question is available obviously in the slides. All of the papers that we've published all of this data and appendices include this. It's freely available on the Innovation Panel's website. So there's lots of places you can go to find the question that we used. It's very openly accessible. As part of this, we also included several help screens. Again, the idea wasn't to overwhelm, but to try and provide information. But then if people wanted additional information, there were these links at the bottom of the screen that allowed them to click through and get a pop-up box with additional pieces of information about what information and who, and how the information will be kept safe. All of these are additional links that could be potentially used. And so we weren't trying to limit the amount of information. We were just trying to provide the amount of information we felt was necessary, and then additional information for those who felt they wanted And those were obviously available both to people in the face-to-face survey or telephone survey. The interviewer could read those if the interviewer respondent asked questions, or in the web survey, the respondent could click through as they like. Now, the VSA had slightly different questions, and so not directly the same in that regard, but similar in content, at least contextually. You can see this graph here presents the number of Twitter users in the three surveys. Red being face-to-face or telephone surveys, so interviewer-based survey, or excuse me, red being web surveys, and the blue being interviewer-based surveys. What you clearly see is that people who answer on the web are also more likely to be Twitter users. There's a whole selection effect thing that we could go into here. Right now, it just seems clear that people who are more comfortable on answering web surveys are also more likely to be using the web potentially for other things. But the numbers for web users, about 28% in the NatCen panel, 25% in the innovation panel, are consistent with national numbers on Twitter accounts that we generally have seen elsewhere. Now, of the users, so this is of the people who said they had a Twitter account. This is not of all the sample, but just of those who said, so for example, 25% web innovation panel, what percentage of them consented? And again, blue indicates the interviewer-based surveys, so telephone or face-to-face, telephone for NatCen panel, face-to-face for innovation panel, and British social attitude survey. Red being the web, and we kind of see the inverse here, right? We see that here, interviewer-based surveys are more likely to obtain consent than web-based surveys, significantly lower in web-based surveys than in interviewer-administered surveys. And that's pretty clear across the board. The NatCen panel, you'll see, even though there is about an 8% difference, a little bit more than an 8% difference, because so few cases, relatively speaking, took place on the telephone, that doesn't achieve statistical significance. But it's very clear that it is directionally that way, and it is probably much more to do with sample size than it has to do with actual lack of significance in that regard. But clearly an impact on mode, and that's something that generally is found across consent studies as well, but important here given that there's a differential population who a higher percentage of people in web surveys who are using Twitter, so there's that dynamic to consider as well. We tried to see if there was additional factors. We ran multivariate analysis or bivariate analysis to try and attempt to identify other factors that could potentially be impacting consent. These are just the significant impacts. In both the British Social Attitude Survey and in the NatCen panel, younger respondents were more likely to consent. This is somewhat different than other consent studies. We posit this is potentially because younger people are more likely to be comfortable with understanding what social media is, and the sharing of it is much more open. We didn't find that impact in the innovation panel. The only significant impact we found in the innovation panel was for mode, again, with face-to-face surveys obtain a significantly higher likelihood of obtaining consent than web surveys. Again, NatCen panel, we didn't find a significance on mode, but again, that's probably due to sample size as much as anything else. One of the interesting things that we're able to do here in this study with this data, because the NatCen panel used the 2015 BSA survey to sample, they had people as part of the 2017 NatCen panel who answered both the consent and questions in 2015 BSA and in 2017 NatCen panel. So we could actually look at some change. Now, not of a huge number of people, but we could still see a a reasonable amount of change identified. So this is this first graph is just the people who have changed their usage from the BSA, indicating that they used Twitter or didn't use Twitter in the BSA, and then their usage currently in the NatSend panel. So the first two are people who said, yes, I use it. Yes, I use it in both BSA and NatSend panel. So that's about 17%. That's how we read that. And the people who said no to using Twitter in both surveys was about 71%. So in this graph and in the following one, which I'll discuss, the really interesting columns, if you will, are the last two, which is where we have the change. So the number of people who said that they used it at the BSA and no longer use it at the NatSend panel was 5%. So there was a 4.5%, 4.6% to be exact, who no longer use it going from 2015 to 2017. But there was a 7.6% increase who said they didn't use it in 2015 and do use it in 2017. So we do have a net increase in Twitter users in this particular sample. Now, when we look at people who were asked, do they consent in 2015, and then if they consented in 2017, again, this can only be of people who used Twitter at both waves. If we're looking at, did you consent at both waves? They would have had to have said they used Twitter at both waves. So this is the yes group. But we can look at changes in consent. And again, these are people who gave the first two columns are people who gave the same consent response at both waves. Either they said yes at both waves or they said no at both waves. What's interesting here, again, is the final two columns, the people who changed. So we again had a net change in new users in the last slide. Here we have a decrease in number of people who consent. So this is the percentage of people who said, yes, I would consent at the BSA, and then when asked again at the NatSend panel said no. So 27% of all Twitter users at both waves changed their consent to no at the later wave, whereas only 6% said no at the first, at BSA, and said yes to NatSend. So we had a net loss of these users. We again posit, although we would need to do more research and we hope to do more research, that this is again largely due to the change in mode. Again, we had a face-to-face only mode at the BSA and a mostly web mode in the NCP. And so if it's due to the mode, we can explain a lot of this change potentially to mode effects. But further research is warranted. So once we have consent, we want to be able to collect the data. And this is to be able to link the data between the two. There's various ways that you can get data off of Twitter. Free ways, many free ways. We are using, in this particular set of examples, the R package called rtweet, which is a set of modules in R. And it links to the Twitter API and extracts the data from the API given a username. We'll collect the list of tweets, the tweet metadata, so this is information. So the list of tweets is obviously what they're actually tweeting, but we'll also get information and if it's available, because you can block things on your Twitter account about such as location, but also information about the time it was tweeted, whether it was retweeted or whether it was a retweet itself. That information is there, but also whatever user metadata is available. And this tends to be about their profile. So how many people they follow, how many people follow them, whether they have a public or private account. Those kinds of information are also collected through the rtweet type of package. To give you an example of what that might look like, now this is an older page, but this is from the ICER Twitter page. And you can see there's some information here about the tweets and pictures and who's following. Those kinds of things are part of when you go to Twitter and you see a Twitter feed, this is something what it might look like. And so this is what it's perceived as in Twitter, and this is what it's perceived as in R, the kind of data you'd see in R. Here, you can see the tweets themselves. So you could see, for example, this first one up here, ICER Essex, is a retweet of an Understanding Society tweet, and then whatever the retweet is. These are the tweets. You have information about the followers down here. And for each types of information, you have the description, for example, that the ICER tweet or the ICER profile put, world leaders in production, etc. So we have that kind of information as well. And that's all imported into R for you to analyze and link to a survey for a given user. Now, obviously in Twitter, a lot of the data, especially the tweets, which are what most people are interested in, is textual in nature. And so how can we analyze that data? So obviously you have to do some kind of text analysis, and there's different ways that you can do text analysis. Again, free packages in R that make it relatively straightforward for people who are comfortable in R programming, all within what's called the tidyverse, uses that, or the TM package, which stands for text mining, or sentiment, which is for sentiment analysis, all in R. There's another package, we pronounce this acronym Luke, coincidentally, and that's for the linguistic inquiry word count. It's much more easy. It doesn't require any programming as such. It's a much more point and click kind of menu, and it will output a lot of pre-existing, from a lot of pre-existing dictionaries, which is the key to all of these analysis. Somebody has to input a dictionary for you then to automatically convert words and match those to the dictionary. Now, one of the things, let's say we have all these ideas, right? What do we want to do? We want to collect this data to compare, or for new measures, or for non-response adjustment, whatever it may be. One of the things that you'll realize very quickly when using Twitter data, which I realized very quickly, was that there was highly variant amounts of Twitter data. So with a survey, you have very fixed sorts of data. It's planned data. You know how much data you should be getting from respondents. Obviously, you can have some item non-response, but it's largely constrained within a certain amount. Twitter data has no such constraints. Twitter data can be 0, or it can be thousands and thousands and thousands, right? If you are a former United States president, for example, you have so many tweets, we wouldn't know what to do with. I mean, it would be an amazing treasure trove. Now it's not even available for the most part, but you get the idea. There's obviously some people who can't wait to get on Twitter to start their day and tell the world what they think, whereas some people are not interested, or very infrequently interested on getting a Twitter. Maybe they just get on to read. Now, this, just like any other differential sample size problem, can create problems in analysis, can create problems in identifying the signal in the noise, so to speak, to use that terminology. With said former president, he tweeted so much, it was very clear what he was going after, right? I mean, obviously there was lots of other things that supplemented that, but so, I mean, I'm using extreme response, but you could think of somebody like that who tweets all the time. It's much easier to identify a pattern in that kind of data than somebody who tweets very infrequently. It also, just statistically, increases the variance, just like it would in any other kind of analysis where you have smaller sample sizes, and potentially could bias the data. So we began to look at this, and this is the actual linkage that we started to conduct. Now, the left-hand side, or at least my left-hand side, I'm not sure how it looks out there, but the dark blue bars, I should say, are what I kind of talked about earlier, where this is the number of people in the innovation panel who have a personal account. Overall, so this is combining web and face-to-face. Overall, 22% said they had a personal account. 9% overall account, so 171 consented to linkage, so 100, but not 9% of the 22%, 9% of the total sample. Of that 171 who said, yes, I'll give you a user, or I consent to that, interestingly, 8 of them didn't give us a username in the follow-up question. So even though they said they would, they didn't then provide us a username. So in essence, they did not give us enough to follow up with. So we ended up getting 163 usernames. Of those 163 usernames, you can see that's the result over here in the light blue bars. 78% of those 163 usernames, or 127 of them, were a public account where we could actually obtain the data from. 16 of them, even though they consented and gave us the username, were private accounts, and so we weren't able to get any tweets. You're still able to get the metadata. So you can get things like number of followers or number of users, which still could be potentially useful, but you can't get the tweet data. 14% provided the invalid username. This goes to some of the measurement kind of problems that we were potentially discussing. So we couldn't find those usernames at all on Twitter. Now, they may be totally deactivated, but they're no longer accessible on Twitter in any way. Finally, 6 of the people who consented and gave us the username were public accounts that had 0 tweets, and so couldn't do anything more with them or anything differentially, for example, than we could with a private account, because we had metadata, but not much more. Excuse me. For these linked accounts, this is the amount of information that we were able to collect from the ones that we were able to actually collect information from. All right, so this is not the people who were private. This is not people who had 0 tweets. These are the people who we were actively able to collect information from and start to begin to analysis. So one of the problems that we obviously are facing is this continual decrease in number, right? The number of people who have a Twitter account, the number of people who consent, the number of people who provide us with the username, the number of people who have a active account. But that doesn't mean that the data isn't there, that we can't work with this kind of data to get methodology. We still end up with a lot of tweets potentially, as you can see. So the number of scraped tweets, or the number of collected tweets, I should say extracted, because that's a better word for what we were doing using the API. But the median was 304, with a mean of 933 and a standard deviation of 1157. Minimum between 1 and 3,200, more or less. Now, this is the number of tweets we were able to access because of limitations to the Twitter API. Allow us only so many access. But if we had done this continuously and we were able to collect all their available tweets, we would have gotten a slightly different number. You can see that the mean jumps up, the standard deviation jumps up even higher, and the maximum, again, is still, the minimum is 1, but the maximum jumps up again. These are, some people are very active tweeters. The most active tweeter in our sample have a total of 36,000 plus tweets that we potentially could access if over time. You could see again in followers, the number of followers and the number of accounts followed. There's really high standard deviations, which gets to the idea here that there's really a lot of variation in how people are using Twitter and the amount of Twitter data that is coming back to us one way or the other. How is that related to the type of person or respondent characteristics that we have? So we were able to use not just respondent characteristics collected from the survey, so we're interested in how many tweets that they've put out there. And we're using a natural log to account for that huge skew. But like, what's the impact of respondent characteristics we collect in the survey, but also metadata from the survey, or metadata from the Twitter data, excuse me, particularly the Twitter followers and the accounts followed. You can see that estimated that females tweet less, are significant. People with higher levels of education tweet more, whereas Number of Twitter followers, also people who have more Twitter followers may tweet more. Now, whether that's a chicken or an egg issue, like you get more followers, so you feel the need to tweet more, or more people follow you because you tweet more. That's an open question, but an important part is that we can use this kind of thing to understand tweeting behavior, whereas the number of account follow, for example, has no significant impact, nor do any of these other types of variables from the survey that we collected. To assess potential bias, we looked at the relationship between these types of the amount of data. We coded them using sentiment analysis, positive or negative, and related it to a survey response, whether they were happy or unhappy, coded from the general health questionnaire, a very widely used survey instrument. So we indicated whether people were happy or unhappy, very basically using that data. And then we regressed on that, their sentiment of their tweets. Very simple. How many positive words they have in their tweet minus the number of negative words in a tweet. We took the difference between the two. If there was more positive words than negative words, it was a positive tweet. If it was more negative words than positive words, it was a negative tweet. It's a very simple and crude measure in that regard, and acknowledged. Again, we're using a dictionary, but the positive is that this was done very automatedly in R using a built-in dictionary. And what we do find is that there is an impact. We don't understand why this impact is necessarily there, but the number of negative tweets are people who tweet more negative tweets are less likely to report being unhappy. So we were predicting an unhappy response. Seems kind of reverse what might be expected, but there may be other kinds of understandings of, people who are truly, truly unhappy aren't getting on Twitter, for example. So, that may be what that's about. You could see other things like number of followers, again, from the tweet metadata, being female, being employed, all have significant impacts on reporting being unhappy. So we can kind of combine traditional survey analysis with the social media aspect to understand people's level of unhappiness. Generally, things to be aware of: Twitter allows for more time-limited time frames because you can only collect the most 3,200 recent tweets from any given person from their API. However, if you're doing this on a very regular basis, which we are currently doing once we did that, you can just keep collecting whatever the 3,200 recent tweets are every month, let's say, and you'll eventually build up a very large database at the micro level for a particular user. Obviously, talked about no control on content, either amount or what they're tweeting about. But also we need to consider about the obsolescence of Twitter. Our current data set is asking for Twitter. What if that changes? What if Facebook no longer is used? You need to think about changing to other social media accounts. The last thing I want to talk about briefly, because other people such as Curtis may be better to kind of discuss this in his talk as well, but is about how we're going to secure this is an important part of our research. We need to provide access to other research to link their data. The problem is Twitter data is identifiable. You have a username, you have a tweet, you can identify that person, and we can't identify survey data. The idea is we promised anonymization. So we need to figure out how to make those linked data sets available to researchers in a way that doesn't that makes it useful both to researchers, but also doesn't impact ethical or anonymization concerns. So we can do things, we've thought about things, we're still getting to that stage. This is obviously early days, so to speak, in the process. But we need to, we've thought about quasi-anonymization, providing cut-down data sets, coded data sets, so we're only providing coded data, not the actual tweet data. That's much easier to provide in an anonymized way. Or try and do training, accreditation, or secure remote access, such as offline and not able to take away the data, and only be able to take away results with review of somebody who is able to do those kinds of reviews in a justified manner. So all of those things are possible. We need to make sure that this is done so we can replicate results and maximize the value of the data. It's great for us. We're publishing a lot of papers, but we also want other people to have access to this data and kind of see the usefulness of this data and be able to publish off of the various kinds of research that they may be able to do from that. There's lots of information about lots of considerations that need to be considered about who is responsible for maintaining the data and sharing the Twitter data sets. One thing is like deleted tweets, for example, a small thing you might think, but by Twitter's terms of service, if someone deletes a tweet ever, it has to be then deleted from all systems. So we would have to delete it from our system. How do we know that someone who deleted a tweet from 2015, for example, we would somehow need to keep a process to keep that up to date? Finally, I've already discussed a lot of our future plans, but a big one is once we kind of have this proof of concept sorted, particularly the archiving and the data creation, we want to move this to the main understanding society with a much larger sample size. And as Twitter and social media continue to grow, kind of expand that area of the study. And, you know, we want to improve consent, which is what Curtis is going to be talking about. We want to look at new measures and how we can potentially use that data better. And that's something that Alex will be talking about. And kind of with that segue, I wanted to leave and say thank you once again